Hello, welcome to today's episode of Frivolous Gravitas, where we'll be talking with a lot of gravitas on more biological matters, specifically development. For this, we've brought in a resident expert, Megan, who is also with us. We also have Chris, who hasn't left.
Hello.
Yep,
so, he's still there.
We're still all here. But we thought it would be better to bring in someone else and give this a bit of a fresh look at things. So if you guys are getting sick of us, here's something a bit new. So I'll hand it over to our guest, Megan, to tell us a little about your expertise and where you're coming from.
Okay, hi, my name's Megan. I have 1.5 degrees in biology-related fields. I'm working on my degree in pharmacy right now. So I have a lot more background in biology than these other two guys here.
What was your original degree in?
My first degree was actually in genetics. And so I have like a pretty big background. I've taken a couple courses in developmental biology as well. So that's kind of where I'm grabbing a lot of this information from. So what I wanted to talk about today was biological sex development, kind of a little bit about how that works. I'm going to start with pretty basic biology and talk about how basically when your baby's born, is it male or female? And then talk about that process and a little bit about sometimes the baby comes out and you're like, I don't know. So you have to, what do we do from there? And what kind of things can go wrong to make that? Or what kind of things can happen that make that, make a baby born that's not obviously male or female. So I wanted to start from the most simple things. Humans are made of cells. Cells contain DNA in the nucleus. Nucleus is a part inside the cell. DNA is a big long substance with 4 different, what we call nucleotides, but basically it's a code with 4 different things in it, variations. And it basically just contains blueprints. And the blueprints tell you and they give you instructions for how to make proteins. Proteins are the things that do everything in your cell. So they can catalyze reactions. They form the structure. They do transport, they signal, they're hormones, they do energy transfer. Basically everything that your body needs to do, it's done by proteins. And how to make proteins is written in the code of the DNA. So that's how that works. I hope that's somewhat clear.
So that does sound it does sound very simple, but we're not dealing with just a couple tiers of you have the DNA of the protein, you have the cell, but it's almost infinitely more complicated than that, which is why
I guess
we're talking about this instead of being because right now we're having this debate in society, in almost global society, where we have these obvious distinctions between male and female, but within that, it's obvious that we have this almost bimodal mechanism for procreation, which manifests in male and female, which are both biologically determined and culturally defined at the same time. You can't really have one without the other. But at the same time, we have these, now it's easy to call something outside of this an anomaly, but when not everything kind of fits into this. Yeah.
Later.
So we have these things that lie outside that simple man, woman come together to create a baby. But biology is never that cut and dry, and
never ever. I'm studying pharmacy, so I can tell you it's very rare that we know exactly 100% how things work and what they're doing, and it's medical science is complicated, so I am trying to I'm definitely leaving stuff out, but just to like continue with my little story of biology. Sorry if I cut you off there, Jordan.
Just trying to keep you going.
Yep. So like so you have this DNA sitting in your nucleus, which has a code that tells you when. It doesn't just tell you how the proteins are made, but it tells you there's different sequences that tell you when proteins are supposed to be made and how much. And that is also determined by other factors in there. So you might have a protein that you don't need unless you're like super stressed out. And what it does is it raises your blood pressure so that you can go run away from the bear. So that thing is only going to happen when you really need it. So things are changed, like your body adapts to what's going on in the.
Does this act kind of like an if statement?
So, a little bit, yeah. It's
only triggered when certain, because a reaction. Like an emotion, like that's triggered like fight or flight, so you get that rush of
fight or flight's not a great example because it's like fight or flight is so fast, like making new proteins takes a while. Like
you're looking at you're walking down the street and it's foggy and boring and cloudy out, and all of a sudden you look over and there's a poster and there's this attractive woman there, and then all of a sudden your body, it's it's a stimulus that affects a change in the chemistry of the body, and your body sees the form, and all of a sudden things start processing and your body's like, oh, I like that. And which is a biological response, right?
It is. And that's more of like a hormone response rather than like actually making new proteins. A better example would be like inflammation. So you get a cut, and you get bacteria in your cut, and your body recognizes that there's foreign material now. And this starts off a huge, incredibly complicated chain reaction that you have a lot of things going on. And one of them is that you'll get these things called transcription factors. And what they do is they bind to DNA and just tell, like in very specific spots, because DNA is a code and parts of the code are like waiting for one specific protein to bind to it. So they'll bind to the DNA and then basically say, make this protein. And what that protein does is it can like increase blood flow to the area. It will like bring in the like cells that eat other cells. It will activate your like antibody response. It's so like that's kind of what I mean by transcription. And that's something that's really important for development, because in development you'll get you'll start with like what we call stem cells. So we've probably all heard of stem cells. They're cells that have the potential to be any cell in your body, but just haven't developed into that yet. So you have stem cells in your body all the time, like your blood you have stem cells in your bone marrow that form all of the cells in your blood, including your immune cells and like your red blood cells and all those guys. So these you start as an embryo with just being like the fertilized egg is basically just a stem cell, and it will divide several times, and then it will start to like form more complex structures, but this is all guided by concentrations of transcription factors. What we call them, like we even call them like master regulators, is the really big ones that say like make an arm or like make this organ here.
So transcription, you're using this word transcription.
Yeah, it's a very specific biological word. So I'll just so that I'm making it make sense. Your DNA can't leave the nucleus; it's stuck in there. But we need to make proteins out of it. Like we need to use it to make proteins. So how does your body do this? So basically, what it does is it copies that. Like your DNA is a very stable molecule, but what it does is it copies it into what we call mRNA, messenger RNA. So it's RNA, which is like DNA, but it has like the sugar is different. The sugar has like one more OH group on it. Hence DNA being deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA is just ribonucleic acid. It doesn't have that deoxy, which is like a lack of oxygen. So that lack of oxygen makes it more stable. So tell me if I'm getting too complex. So your RNA isn't as stable, but what it can do is it can leave the nucleus. So it goes it gets some editing being done. It gets like big chunks of it spliced out, and the chunks that it's spliced out is just like regulatory sequences or other things that we're not sure what they do. And then it gets brought out of the cell, and then you have a separate system called translation, which makes that into a protein, and that's through like ribosomes. That's a whole other process but just as long as you recognize that the RNA, your DNA gets transcribed into RNA, and then your RNA can leave the nucleus and then be turned into a protein. Well, not turned into a protein, but then read, and then it's a code for protein. And that code also includes like where it needs to go as well. And if it needs further mods.
Why don't we first off follow you through your whole step-by-step from start to finish, and then after you're done that, we'll start picking apart the parts that are unclear, just so that we get the big scope first, and then we'll refine our...
Okay. Yeah, so that was like most of the cellular biology that I really needed to focus on. I also just need to talk a little bit about mitosis and meiosis, which is... Mitosis is just the process of your cells splitting in half. I don't need to talk about like the specific phases, but know that the cells that it forms at the end are completely identical to the first cell, and that's the point. Like you have like a lot of your cells in your body that you just need to replace them. They'll just replace themselves like that. And then we've got a thing called meiosis, and this is for making your gametes. So I'm gonna focus on like the male process just because it's more simple, but basically you have your precursors to sperm, and so let me back up for 1 second. So I didn't actually talk about chromosomes yet. So your DNA is organized into 23 separate chromosomes, chunks of DNA. They're very long, but they're organized by size. Like there's nothing mystical about what makes chromosome 5 and chromosome 6. It's just the biggest one is chromosome 1 and the smallest one is chromosome 22. That's all it is. And then also like your chromosome 23 is what's their sex chromosomes. That's your X and Y. Generally, I will get to the exceptions of this. XX is a female and XY is a male. So when Henry VIII was really mad that none of his wives would give him sons, it was actually his fault because the men determined the gender, the sex of the baby, because women only have X's, so they can only contribute X's. Men contribute X or Y, so it was actually his fault. So yeah, that's how that works. So just to talk through the process of meiosis, because you need to know a little bit about this to just know how the chromosomes are split up. So you have your like one precursor cell, which still has your 46 chromosomes. So you've got one copy of each from each of your parents. So chromosome 1, you have one from mom, one from dad. Same for every single one. Of course, there's always exceptions. There are a couple of cases where you can have different numbers of chromosomes and still be like viable. Down syndrome is trisomy 22. Or 21, sorry. Trisomy 21. So you have 3 chromosome 21s.
Could you explain the word viable? Because I feel like...
I'm sorry. I that's a very specific term. I just mean that you like are able to be born and be alive. That's all I mean. So there's a couple other trisomies as well, but they either are spontaneous abortions or they only live for like months or days. So what I mean by viable, I'm not trying to like say anything social. I just mean that they're able to survive and like be alive. Okay. That's all I mean. So thanks for correcting me on that.
It's not really a correction. It's a word. It's like someone could call someone, "You're not viable." And it's like, ooh. So
it's used different in science than in general population.
Yeah, like and it's like a genetics kind of term for there's like some like there's some gene mutations that like you cannot make a human without this gene working, so it's considered non-viable. Like it will be born and live for 2 days, but it like won't have a brain, so like that's considered not viable. That's what I mean by that. Anyway, so going back to your just meiosis process, the goal of this one is to create a genetically new cell, different cell, that has only half the chromosome complement that a normal cell does, because to make the baby, you want to have like some from mom and some from dad, right? Because you're both going to have half the number of chromosomes, so that when there is fertilization, now you have the proper number of chromosomes. So there is also an important point, which will come up when I talk about SRY translocations. Don't worry, I'll get to it. Where all of your chromosomes, so all the ones you get from mom and all the ones you get from dad, they line up in a way that all the genes are like lined up together and they exchange information. So at the end of this process, you will have created a new chromosome in your sperm or egg that has like pieces from your mom and pieces from your dad.
And they're lined up in order, right?
Like in order, so that all the genes match up.
Number 3 goes to number 3, and they'll take half of number 3 from one side, half of number 3 from the other side, and make a new number 3.
Yeah, pretty much. There'll be like several different pieces of crossover, so you get like one chunk. This is from, like if you're looking at your own genes, it'll be like this chunk's from grandma, this chunk's from grandpa, this chunk's from grandma, and so on. So that's done to like it increases the amount of variation in the kids by like just an obscene amount. It's an incredibly useful process to create more diversity.
Because it's like exponentially, right? Binary,
yeah.
But exponentially binary.
Very much, like a huge amount. And there is also, so your X and Y chromosomes, just to jump back for a second, the X is a huge chromosome, like it's massive. And the Y chromosome is very small. So, and the Y chromosome does not have like a huge amount of genes on it, but it does have some in common with the X. So they do actually undergo this process as well. So there is some exchange between X and Y. Not a lot, but there is a little bit. And yeah, just to increase the diversity in those areas as well. Okay, does that make sense so far? Sort of, kind of. Okay. So now that we have the like cellular basics, we can go into like how this stuff, how like the development process actually works. So so after you have like fertilization, it usually takes about a week before it's implanted in the uterus. But during that time, there's lots of cell division, and also they're like reorganizing themselves and creating different tissue types. Yeah.
So this is after conception?
Yeah, after conception.
So maybe because we have the gametes sitting in their little gamete part, the testes. And
they're made in the testes or ovaries, yeah.
Yeah, and so then they do their thing where they go to that place where they can interact with the other side, other gamete.
I suppose, yes.
Being very diplomatic here. But so then we're kind of skipping ahead to the part where they, meet each other. And
yeah.
He means sex.
He's talking about sex. Yeah, that's I was also skipping over that. Another more for interest sakes, just because I'm talking in the area, a lot of like, so you've heard that like women make all their eggs when they're like still in utero. So they actually like stop twice during their like cell meiosis cell division part. So they don't actually like fully finish their like making of a proper like cell with half the genetic complement until they're fertilized. So they stop once, like when the girl is still like a fetus. And then the process resumes partially when the egg is being ovulated, or like when it's being prepared to be ovulated, and then it stops like again until fertilized. Yeah.
So it's like putting food in the freezer and then taking it out when you're ready to eat it.
Pretty much. Whereas men just buy it from the store and then that's it. They gotta eat it right away.
Yeah.
There's no stopping, but like it's constant. You're always making that. Whereas women, once you run out, you hit menopause and suffer. Something to look forward to. Yeah.
Because God's got a sense of humor.
Sure, we'll go with that.
Terrible sense of humor.
Irony is funny.
We did our like sex, reproductive health section last semester, and it's like, man, sometimes I wish I was a guy. Holy crap.
Just
anyway.
Sometimes. Pissing in the woods?
yeah, that's definitely you have to pee and you're outside and you're like,
there are a few
where's my
downsides.
directional urethra? yeah. Yeah, but free drinks at the bar.
Another episode, maybe. Or I guess just later. Gender differences. That's still applicable.
Yeah, okay. We can still get into
and
that.
Distributing them.
Cultural differences in gender might be yeah.
Well, yeah, some have a lot more
literally
difference than others.
But do proceed.
Yes. Okay. So where was I? We were talking. Yeah. Okay. Jordan got distracted because I talked about sex a little bit.
Me too. So it was good that we took a detour.
Okay. Yeah. That is. I was talking about that. Yeah. So you have them, the sperm and egg meeting in a lovely fashion or whatever, and then once the fertilization happens, then the ovum finishes its like the rest of its meiosis. And then the nuclei combine, and then the like whole dividing process starts. So it's just growing, or no, it doesn't grow. It just divides. It's called cleavage. Okay, I was expecting giggles. Cleavage is just cell division without growth, but so it divides a whole bunch into like smaller cells, and then they start to like reform, and then they start to like differentiate, which is a word that just means they're now becoming, because I talked about stem cells have potential to become anything. As they differentiate, they lose the potential to become certain things. So once it becomes like endothelial cell, then it can't become skin anymore. So like it narrows itself down in scope the more you go, because like
crosses the Rubicon basically of its own development. It can go further down a branch, but it can't step back once it hits a certain point. That's the differentiation.
Actually we can do that. There was a Nobel Prize awarded for that a few years ago. I don't remember which year it was, but I
remember that.
Yeah, we did find there was 4 genes that you can use to like get skin cells and then turn them back into stem cells and then redifferentiate them.
But we're talking generally speaking, your fingernail doesn't become a finger again.
No, once it's there, it's
that would
there.
Be awkward.
That's what it is.
Our hair grew heads of hair.
It just starts making muscle cells on the outside of your body. Yeah, no, that's gross. Yeah, so it starts to do that development, and then you get the formation of both Müllerian ducts and Wolffian ducts. So these are like Müllerian ducts. If they continue to develop, will form the like female anatomy. So the uterus, the cervix, all that stuff. The Wolffian ducts will form the male anatomy, which I'm sure I don't need to explain, but I can. So there is a point where all human fetuses have both of these systems in place.
Do you know what period roughly in the gestation?
I do. That was my next point. So in the 7th week of development is kind of where they're both like present and sitting there. So this is week 7. I mentioned the SRY region earlier. I told you I would get back to it. So it's a gene that exists on the Y chromosome normally. And it makes a protein called the TDF, or the testes determining factor. And what this does is it just says, hey body, make a penis. That's what it does. So it's one of those transcription factors. It leads to another transcription factor, which basically what it does is it tells the Müllerian structures, so the ones that have the possibility to become female structures, it tells them to stop developing, so then they die off. And that it also, there's like several different mechanisms, but it basically starts making testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, which is like testosterone but more potent, and a couple other things, and then that makes it finish making the Wolffian structures, which is your male structures. So that's what that region does. The SRY region on your Y chromosome. So that is why generally if you see a Y chromosome, you can assume it's a male.
So what exactly, just for the terminology's sake, what's the relationship between SRY and TDF?
Yeah, so the SRY is like the physical gene, the part of the DNA, the code, and the TDF is the protein that's created by interpreting that DNA.
Ah, I see. Thank you.
Genetics has like an obscene amount of nomenclature.
Oh, that's good. That's what you're here for. Like, honestly, that's my favorite part of all this.
Well, like even in my notes that I made for this, I like made sure to italicize the gene name because you're supposed to italicize the gene and not the protein. Like it's just
nice.
Then there's like capitals and not capitals depending on whether it's mouse or not. Like it's there's a lot going on. So so basically, so if you don't have that TDF present, the protein present, then there are also other processes to like promote female development, but they're not as well understood. There's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that doing experiments in human embryos is not a thing that we can do. It's incredibly unethical. Like you can't just like make a test tube baby and then grow it up for 8 weeks and then just kill it when you're done. Or the other thing, or like make one and then delete a specific gene and then see how it develops wrong. Like that's just not a thing we can do with humans.
Intentionally give it genetic defects.
Yeah, because that's how genetics has been studied. Like that's how early
we should do.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They are doing it in China
and Russia.
So
can we prove that, or are we just saying
there
things?
Are people who had surgeries that would not otherwise be accounted for, were it not for their account of being abducted and.
Yeah, because I've heard of the gene harvesting, not the gene, the organ harvesting.
There was like
they do them in tandem though. Usually, it's a poor family exploit or somebody who's in prison, and they do a lot to their prisoners too, or the encampments of the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong and whatever.
There was definitely a rumor that bodies exhibit that was around like 10 years ago or so was like Chinese like political prisoners.
Yeah, people were saying that they looked strikingly Asian.
Yeah, so anyway, I went to that exhibit. I thought it was cool. I also didn't know that until like years later, so anyway.
Yeah, they were protesting right outside my work because the exhibit was downtown on Portage here in Winnipeg.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess it was just
Paris building next to it.
I guess I just didn't. Oh, well, maybe I saw you then.
Yeah, probably. I smoked a lot.
Well, I was like a plucky high school girl, so yeah, where was I going with this? So
can I ask you another question then?
Yeah, sure.
You did mention like hormones affecting growth and transcription factors and stuff. What about like HGH and, anabolic steroids and that kind of, does that affect?
If you are pregnant and you're taking anabolic steroids, yes, that will definitely affect the sex development, because
do you know
what
roughly
it will
what
do,
kind of effect we could expect from it? Like, does it trigger certain things?
It will. If you're taking like a lot, you might like seriously mess up the sex development. But if you're like more accidentally exposed or just a little bit, then you might just get what we refer to as ambiguous genitalia. So they'll still
like a clitoris and testicles kind of thing.
Like a like just a huge clitoris basically, and you might get some like closing, but like that it might just be like minor if it's only a little bit, and they might still like be fertile and just develop normally as a woman, just from some exposure. Another point to note here is that 50% of pregnancies, at least the statistics that I heard from this, are unplanned. So it's very possible that if a woman was like using anabolic steroids and became pregnant and then didn't know about it until like a month or two in, that is definitely a possibility. Also, a sad fact is that the most, like, using alcohol is most devastating in like close to day 20. I want to say day 18 to 21, something like that, of like gestational age. So it's which
when
is again
still might
in that first month. So yeah, they might not know they're pregnant. So I guess my message to everyone here is use contraception. If you're worried, use more than one type of contraception. And if you're worried, don't drink alcohol until you know for sure. Get a pregnancy test, figure it out. Like do your best. It might still happen.
Be a responsible human being.
But like it might still happen, but just try to be as responsible as you can. There's lots of options for contraception. not just the pill. So I don't know how I came onto this topic, but
hey, it's worth noting. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah, like there's more than just pill. There's injections. There's like intrauterine devices. Because a lot of people are bothered by hormones, so you get like a copper IUD as well, which has no hormones in it at all. A lot of women prefer that sort of thing.
Condoms are still tried and tested for the most part.
Condoms
right?
are still good. They are honestly there's data that's like less good, but I think there's human error inputted into some of these things.
Yeah.
So
people aren't the smartest, especially in the
properly.
situation.
They do have expiry dates.
Yes, that's a good one to note. And like always test them and make sure, check the expiry date.
Make sure they're the right size.
Don't use 2 at once.
Yeah, the right size always helps. And don't use 2 at once.
Yeah, don't just buy the biggest size to impress people. They're going to see it anyway, so they're going to know.
Yeah, this is definitely the right size of condom. Hold on, let me get this open.
Quadruple XL, like no, buddy.
So, yeah.
So just very obscene side note about that.
Reproductive health is super important, and I don't think enough people talk about it, just for the record. So I'm glad you brought it up.
I completely agree with you. There's lots, and I've heard a lot of stories of women that have like a lot of issues with like their period, like they're just like super depressed, or they have lots of bleeding, lots of pain. And like we talked a lot about that in my pharmacy school. So a lot of people are like aware, and I think things are starting to change for the better, instead of just being like, "Ha, you're on your period, sucks to be you." Bye. Like we're starting to like learn a little bit more about how to treat like not even just like more serious things like endometriosis, PCOS, that sort of thing, but like just I bleed a lot, or I have a lot of pain, and sometimes
and knowing what's more than normal and less than normal helps you treat
though what they tell us is normal is like kind of obscene. But so there's a lot. I think women's health is getting better for sure, and I think it will continue to get better. And I think also like as healthcare gets like slowly overtaken by women, something I've definitely noticed in pharmacy is that like there's a lot more male pharmacists like 20-30 years ago. Now my class is like probably 2/3 female, maybe a little more. It's just an estimate.
As a person who's dealt with a lot of doctors and like medical conditions and stuff, I much prefer a female pharmacist. They go out of their way to take the time to make sure that you feel okay with the drugs you're taking, whereas men pharmacists generally and stereotypically, maybe we'll get into this later, but they're more interested in making sure they've done their job so that they don't get in trouble.
Like
I've had way less emphasis on the comfort of the patient.
I've had that with male doctors as well, where you get the process is more important than the person.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we're coming up on the end of the time here. It's like, I haven't finished describing the problem.
Yeah, and they want to jump to a diagnosis before they have all the data because they have enough data to jump to the diagnosis, or vice versa. Like they don't have enough
like
to put their name on something
very
and hang a hat on it.
I've been finding, because like I'm not fully trained yet, I've been finding it so difficult to not just be like, oh, it's this, okay, bye. Like it's very, you have to like, especially because like a lot of the people that get into like medicine and pharmacy and these types of jobs like are generally pretty smart people. I don't want to like just like tug my own horn here, but but like the kind of people are like, we like being right and we like solving problems quickly, and I often find myself holding myself back and being like, no, think through the process, what can we do, don't just hand the metformin and be done with it, like figure it out. So there's
I think that's really important though. Like the pharmacy is the front line between the patient ultimately and the chemicals they're putting in their body. Like it's really important that if something was missed in the steps leading up to a prescription, that the pharmacist be competent enough to catch it.
Yeah, and there's like lots of things that doctors don't think about, like your kidney function. Like that's kind of one of the things that like stands out is kidney function. There's like an endless amount of interactions, and some of them aren't that bad. Some of them are just you're taking 2 drugs that could make you tired, so you might be more tired. And like maybe like tell them not to drive for the first little while. Like you kind of, there's a lot going on and it's complicated, and pharmacists also learn so much more about how your drug is metabolized and like how your body processes it than doctors do. So there's like a advantage there.
And augmentations too, because most of the people they meet most regularly are going to be people who have more prescriptions. So you're going to be dealing a lot more with complications or what do they call that? Comorbid conditions and interoperability, I guess, or activation.
Comorbid just meaning you have more than one thing. So maybe you have like diabetes, but you also have depression and you also have like heart problems or whatever. So now now you have to worry about like, what if, or like anti-epileptics, for instance, all anti-epileptics have a warning on them that they increase the risk of suicide. So if you have someone that has seizures and also is depressed, now you have to like tell them about this, tell them to be aware of it. So like there's just a lot of like little things that are...
The problem, the complexity sort of grows exponentially too, because as you have two comorbid conditions and two medications, the medications can interact with each other, but they can also interact with the other condition.
Yes.
As they interact with their own condition. And likewise, the conditions can interact with even when they're not supposed to.
Like something like Parkinson's is especially like, Jordan's being like, why are you still talking? Okay. Something like Parkinson's is really important because there's a lot of drugs that you just shouldn't use in Parkinson's because it can make the disease worse. So now you have like, it's complicated. Like I said at the beginning, the more you learn, the worse it gets.
And that's why it's complicated though. I think it's helpful that people hear like, not just that it's complicated and some black box that nobody can possibly know, but like we do know something of the thing we don't know about.
Yeah.
So I'd like to get us back on track.
Okay.
I think we were about 18 to 10, 20 days past conception.
Yeah, so I was kind of like really focusing on that 7th week there, where you get that like distinction between basically is TDF present or not, but there's a couple other things that are important in this process. So what if it's not a problem with TDF, like you have TDF, but your receptors for testosterone don't work very well. So that's what's called androgen insensitivity, which depending on the amount that the receptor, so you can have like 2 receptors with 0 function. And that means you just don't respond to testosterone. So it's the same as if you had 0 testosterone in your body. So these people are born female. They have female-looking bodies. They go through puberty, but they don't menstruate. They develop breasts. They pretty much indistinguishable from other females. But they are technically XY. There was a Olympic runner, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, that had this and was like told, nope, you're a man, you can't have the medal, which is incredibly silly because the chromosome doesn't determine your sex. It's the genes you have and the environment that determines your sex inside the body. Because like the other thing that can happen is you can have that SRY gene jump onto an X chromosome, as we talked about with the crossing over, when your DNA all lines up. So you can have that SRY gene on an X chromosome, and then now you have a child that inherits that, so they're XX, which you're like, they should be female, right? Because they're XX. But no, they have that region, so they become male.
For anyone interested, the athlete in question was Caster Semenya from South Africa.
Okay.
If anyone wants to go look that up.
Thank you. I just remember talking about her in the class I did about this. So that one was interesting because I remember taking anthropology in school, and that being used as a evidence that that sex is a construction. It doesn't matter. Male and female don't really matter. You have this ambiguity here, which means that the whole deck of cards is wrong. And I think what that point is doing is seeing it's complicated black box, and instead of saying it's complicated, let's try to figure it out, they just say it's complicated so nobody can know, which is kind of lazy in my opinion. Like, there's more to it than just, oh, they're XX and they have penis, so they're actually a woman. Also, sex and gender don't matter. Like, that's not the point to make here. That's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make the point that it is complicated, but we can try to understand some of it. And
right. So I think one of the things here is that we're, especially in that particular anthropology class, the ideas of male and female themselves were being called into question. Are these are culturally developed ideas, because we literally have to make a word for them: male, female. These are English words, but they do have analogs in other societies. So
yeah,
even though they're culturally constructed words, I'm not willing to think that these
they still
don't represent biological realities.
They still have a basis in reality. Like, there's a word for glass. Most languages have a word for some sort of drinking receptacle. That doesn't mean that glasses aren't real or glasses aren't the same as cups. Like, they're words and they have meaning, but and they have cultural meaning, but they are based in something that actually exists.
Right. So, and it's about this time when that distinction becomes apparent in the uterus, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's not always. So I've been talking about examples of so the terminology used now is disorders of sex development, which also there's some arguments against because it specifically says disorders. I'd make an argument that some of them are actual medical issues that have other things like salt wasting and issues, and some of them are more just infertility and ambiguous genitalia, which isn't really as bad. But there's there's lots of things that are called a disorder that aren't necessarily bad. It's kind of just, it's a medicalized word, but
right. Well, the other thing is that you have this idea of a disorder. Now, you are, for some reason, there's some chemical process happening there, which changes the way that the cells that will become the adult you are formed and affect how that changes the way that you function in a certain way. But that doesn't mean that you aren't you, and that doesn't denigrate the idea that even though this happened to you in utero, you aren't able to live, your life. Unless you are, I guess, as maybe a scientist would call it, non-viable, and you literally can't live your life because
you don't have a life. That's kind of what that means.
You're not alive.
I just want to talk more about, sorry, I'm just going to jump back for a second. The word disorder kind of falls from the old biomedical model, where you're kind of this is an ideal human. This is what you should be like. If you are not like this, there is something incorrect and wrong. So that's kind of an old model, old way of looking at medicine.
Right.
We're definitely coming away from that quite a bit. Just looking at things as at some point things become there's a problem. Your fasting blood glucose is 3 times what this person's is. That's an actual problem. And sometimes there's just variation that isn't really that important. But it's also even something like bipolar disorder is called bipolar disorder. But some people with bipolar, when they go into their hypomania, which is mania but less severe, they get the most work done. They work 23 hours a day. They're super hyper vigilant, and they run the society. Is that a disorder?
Yeah,
it's kind of a pointless conversation.
It's like my ADHD when I go into the bush. It's all of a sudden my ADHD becomes very much an asset, and I can pay attention to every single leaf in the forest for some reason. But
it can be an asset if you're a hunter-gatherer society and you have people that are more vigilant. But then when we try to sit you down in a school when you're 8 years old and you can't sit still, that's not an asset anymore.
I start vibrating.
Is it a disorder? Probably not.
But then,
is it still called a disorder? Well, the DSM is another whole problem, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual or whatever it's called. Everyone that reads the the DSM has some sort of mental health disorder because that's how it's written. But that's another problem for another day.
So if
I think the way they try and define the disorder, though, is, or the dysfunction, is based on whether or not it impedes your ability to function at a normal rate that would be expected otherwise. I think that's sort of how they're
okay, fair enough.
So it's only dysfunctional if it's creating dysfunction.
Right. So and on multiple levels. So so
there's like
something like Tourette's, which makes it very it's not really a dysfunction, it just makes it kind of hard to work with in a public setting. But then you get someone who's born without legs, and that's a very physical disadvantage to that particular person. So these things have multiple, but now I kind of want to bring it back, and we have these categories of male and female, which appear to be biological and then defined culturally. That really we saw them like you're a male or a female, but now we're seeing, and the word keeps getting passed around a lot nowadays, is the word spectrum. And we've used it on our channel before a couple times. I think Chris is particularly fond of using it, especially with regard to politics. But it is a very useful word, where you have, instead of, this Boolean value, you have a...
it's bimodal. It's like for sex especially, it's very much bimodal, like 98% of the population. I pulled that number out of my
Could you go into bimodal, what that means?
But it's just two peaks. So you have like a huge peak by like where like your traditional female would be, and a huge peak by where your like traditional man is, and then there's like other people that are in the middle. So like two
bell curves.
And the reason why I use the word spectrum instead of gradient is because a gradient implies a certain incline. A gradient is unidirectional, where it's, so that's why spectrum is used, because it implies that there's a bandwidth alongside the distribution.
Implies more than one dimension, basically.
Even on that, you get people that are in the middle, but then on the same time, you find people that are like men that are like represent like an over masculinity or a over femininity, but at the same time you have people that don't really register.
Well, and then there's also something to be said as a difference between like you are like you're female, everything about your anatomy's female, you have like female like anatomy, everything is definitely that, but you have like lots of very traditionally masculine traits. Like you're still like a biologic. You still were like you were born as a female, but like just because you have masculine traits, like they're not exactly the same, is my point.
Right. And I think we also confuse what are masculine and feminine traits as well, because
there's definitely variation in that.
Playing certain video games, I guess, but that's not really like...
like is playing.
Boys play video games. It's like, no, a lot of girls play video games too.
Yeah.
Or
I think we should only use those descriptions when they're statistically relevant, though. Like YouTube videos, if you look up how to, that's like more than 90% or more than 80% for sure. I can't remember the exact figure, but YouTube offers these statistics, so they're open to the public. That men will look up coding videos and women will look up cosmetic videos. Like they're
like there's definitely differences.
Watch cat videos is probably negligible whether they're male or female, but with cosmetics specifically, it's mostly female, and with how to code is specifically mostly male.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Or you go on and how do I fix my drill or something, and it's going to be a guy in his shop or But there is, well, with that, in any of these male or female things that we traditionally see as them, there's always overlap.
Always.
I believe that even recently, your instructor for your that firearm safety course that you went to was female, which isn't usually expected. You have mainly you have a lot of these kind of things. There's always a an outlier in every category, and this isn't evidence
we're
of
people. We're not
exactly.
We're
allowed to
humans. We like different things, and there's always going to be ladies that want to work in the oil fields, even though it's like traditionally a more masculine job. And there are more men that work in the oil fields here, but there's always going to be women that are attracted to jobs like that and do well in jobs like that.
Yeah.
And that's not doesn't have anything to do with their chromosomes or their hormones or anything. So that was kind of the point I was trying to make. I can like bring it back. So I was talking about androgen insensitivity, and I was talking about what we call like complete androgen insensitivity, where like the runner that we were talking about earlier, where they're just like female, most of them identify as female, but like that's not always. Again, I'll get into that in a moment. So then you can have like partial and mild androgen insensitivity, and this just means that you might have. So you get like 2 copies of everything, right? So you might get 1 copy that works well and 1 copy that's completely dysfunctional, or you might get 2 copies that kind of work. So it just depends on what exact variation you have. But if you've got partial, you're going to be like a lot more. You'll get like ambiguous genitalia when you're born. You won't menstruate. You won't have like the female structures, but you won't have like. You'll only have like partially developed like the Wolffian structures, the more male structures. So like something like that is a lot more ambiguous. And individuals that have this can identify male or female, or sometimes neither. So this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated when people are like very much in between. And like everyone that has like partial androgen insensitivity syndrome will be a little bit different, and you'll treat them differently depending on what they want. So there was a big, in like the 60s when they started working, the idea was very much that like having like ambiguous genitalia and this sort of like, I don't know what gender the baby is, was like bad. And they thought that that was terrible, that anyone that had to live a life like that was horrible. So what we should do is we should make them either male or female. And it was basically kind of left up to the parents, but also surgeons. And like they'd do some genetic testing, but I mean, again, they were really only looking at chromosomes because they didn't really have the ability to do as intensive genetic testing as we have now, just technology changes. So they'd be like, yep, they're XX, so just make them into a female. And like a lot of these kids were really unhappy. They would have like long like pamphlets that they would give people about like how to lie to your child about how they were born. And like it was just not overall not really a good idea, because you're just taking all the choice away from this person. And then sometimes the surgeries that they would do on, like if they decided to, and like they would use silly things like the size of their penis when they were born to be like, yep, it's too small, so we're going to make this into a female, which is like really messed up. And then say that
ouch,
kid.
Eh? Like talk about like save this guy's self-esteem by qualifying him as a female for having too small of a penis.
Yeah, well then they would do the operation, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard about the operation that is done for like trans women, but they kind of cut it up and then like invert it. So they would do this to a baby, and then raise it as a female, like wearing dresses, and like this was the 60s, so they'd be like, you know,
you're talking about John
toys.
Mooney, right? Or John Money?
Perhaps. I didn't.
The doctor's name?
I think there was like some John Hopkins University, something that I was hearing about. So I'm not exactly sure where. Like some of this I remember from my degree, and some of those I read about in the last few days. So like, if I knew where I knew everything I know from, I wouldn't know as much. But
because we have I looking this up just quickly, and we have John Money and David Reimer.
Okay,
who were doing the first gender reassignments.
Yeah, so they were like advocating for like we should just make them something, whatever is like easier to surgically do. Or sometimes the parents would be like, no, I really, really want to have a son. So then they would just like make it into a boy. And like a lot of the kids were pretty unhappy because they were being lied to, really. And sometimes you chose wrong. So they'd be like 15 and be like, yeah, I'm definitely a woman. And they're like, well, too late. So nowadays the idea, and I like just because I don't want people to like have the wrong assumptions about how it's treated nowadays, I did actually go onto like resources that I have access through pharmacy about like current medical, like what's recommended for doctors. And like very much the recommendations now are in what we call shared decision making, which is basically just sitting down with the patients and the patient's parents, family, and saying, look, here's the facts, here's your options, here's the pros and cons of these options. What do you think? And if they say, I have no idea, then you can make a suggestion, and you're working with the patient to like try to figure out what the best idea is. This is something that's very, very much being pushed in classes and schools now in medical professions, is just to like, instead of just saying, like walking into the office and just being like, yep, here's your drug kit, go home, bye. You really want to sit down and say like, this is how this drug works. Like, this is how this other option works. Like, what would you prefer? Like, would you rather like have a drug that could make you gain weight or have a drug that could make you sleepy every day? So you kind of like are involving the patient a lot more. And that's kind of what the idea is now. Because like the steps that you would want to do if a baby is born, there are, and like, you're not like they have like ambiguous genitalia or like some sort of like sex development thing going on. Like you really have to sit down. The other point I wanted to make is I wanted to talk about CAH. It's congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is the most common cause of ambiguous genitalia. And this, like, you're missing at one, and there's a few different mutations that it could be, but you're missing an enzyme in like creating steroid hormones. So you end up having deficiencies in different steroid hormones, which includes your sex steroids, but also includes your like cortisol and fludrocortisone, which is like a mineral corticoid that regulates salt in your body. So babies with this can have what we call salt wasting. So they have really, really low sodium, which leads to low water as well and dehydration. They can also have like issues relating to the less cortisone as well. Like they just won't be feeding, they'll be sleeping, they could die from this. So this is like really, really serious. So when kids are, if a kid presents with like ambiguous genitalia, they're always tested for this first, just to make sure that they don't have these other hormonal issues as well, because it's treatable. You basically just have to give them pills for the rest of their life. And like the pills are kind of, because I'm in pharmacy school, I have to talk about them a little, but like they're kind of like a bit annoying because you have to change the amount of dosing depending on activity. So your fludrocortisone, which is related to like holding on to salt and water in your body, if it's like 40 above and you're working outside, you have to take a lot more because you'll have too much salt loss otherwise. And
so is the CAH then a gene or is it an enzyme that triggers?
CAH is the name of the condition. There's a few different mutations, and there's like, they all have silly names. It's like, give me a sec.
So it's not like the name of a process or of a string or anything, right?
It's because it's like the metabolism to make these hormones. There's like different enzyme pathways, so it's like problems with those enzymes. So you have, I think one's like 21 hydroxylase or something is one. I think that's the most common one. And then there's just other ones in the process, but depending on like which enzyme in the process and like how bad the deficiency is, like do you have like one copy that's just completely useless? Do you have one copy that like works a little bit? And yeah, so like how, and the other issue is that it is X-linked. So that means it's on your X chromosome. One of them, at least one of the genes is on the X chromosome. There are other ones that are not on the X chromosome. So again, it's like a family of genetic diseases that present similarly. This happens relatively frequently where like the disease looks the same. So you classify it all in the same group, and then you do more research and find out it's actually like several different genetic anomalies that's causing it. But
so in talking about all these interactions, sorry if I keep stopping you, but I'm just trying to get a clear mental picture of it. From my understanding, most of these molecules interact with lock and key mechanisms, like where one has an opening that only fits a certain other opening, and that's how the two enzymes or whatever bind one set of solutions to another set of solutions. Is that always the case? Is it always like a problem with a lock and key combination? Or
in this case, well, it's not always, because you can get like things that so basically these enzymes that are involved in the process. So you have your like molecule that you're trying to make in a steroid molecule. It's got a 4-ring structure. It's very distinctive, but it's like all the stuff on the outside of that 4-ring structure is different for each one. But basically that fits perfectly into an enzyme, like active site is what it's called. And then the active site makes the molecule sit in such a way that the reaction that you want to happen happens exactly the way you want it to. So then that like allows it to move on to the next step. But
so it's almost like its physical form is determining the actual response action.
That's exactly what it is. Structure determines function with proteins. That's like drilled into our mind. That like if you get like one change, like one different amino acid. So I didn't really talk about amino acids, but proteins are made of amino acids, and like the DNA like codes for like, here I want an alanine, then I want like whatever other, I can't think of it, valine here, and then whatever. You just keep adding more amino acids into a chain, and then the chain has to fold into a very specific way, which is a complex process, very complex process that
we'll be talking about that in an upcoming episode of Neural Nets, actually.
Oh, exciting.
Foreshadowing.
Okay. Ooh, yeah, they had that new AI come along. That's really sweet. Yeah, so anyway, so if you have like something wrong in the active site, then the enzyme's just not going to work at all. So let's say you have the wrong amino acid like on the other side, and it was like supposed to be a basic acid, and now it's an acidic acid. Like that's a problem. But I know saying basic acid doesn't make sense, but like they're called
simple acid.
They're still called amino acids, but like they use an acid-base reaction to like hold themselves together, and then like they have another part coming out of it that determines the different structures, and sometimes they have like an acidic group and sometimes they have a basic group, and that also determines the structure of the protein and like the function as well. But like if you've got like a really wrong thing on the other side, it might affect the folding of the protein, so maybe it doesn't fold quite right, but it's still close enough that it can kind of do its job, but poorly.
It's just kind of gimpy.
Yeah, it's just gimpy. And there's other ones that you have that you can like get a stop codon is what it's called. So basically you might have like, I don't know, like 80 amino acids in this gene, but the third one is just actually a stop now. So you just create this chain of 2 that just gets eaten up. So that's like, it's the stopping too quickly. So that's completely not functional.
Is that similar to acting like a telomere?
Not really. Telomeres are like big, long things that are on the end of your chromosomes that just prevent it from getting eaten and falling apart. So
those are more like knots or braids?
We're talking like telomeres are like on the structure of chromosomes, and right now we're talking on the structure of individual genes.
So tiny fractions of chromosomes. Then.
You do actually have, because now we're getting more into virology here, but like your body doesn't like random RNA floating around. Because viruses often use RNA, so it'll chew it up. So basically any RNA that's coding or like useful and necessary in your body is like specific. So like your messenger RNA, which will code for the protein, will have like a bunch of A's on the end, and will have a cap on one side so that your body doesn't chew it up right away. It's a viral defense mechanism.
But that's different from a stop in what way? Like, can you compare those two?
Because a stop just basically tells the machinery, the translation machinery, which is your ribosome. And your ribosome basically just, it reads the mRNA and then puts the protein together. And the stop codon just tells the ribosome to go away. So your mRNA is still there, but it's just, instead of saying put an alanine here, it says, okay, my protein's done now. So then the machinery just leaves, and now your protein is 2 amino acids long and is just going to get chewed up.
The rest is scrapped, or is it reused?
It's reused. Everything's reused.
Oh, cool.
Until it can't be. And then and then you just poop it out, I guess.
Do we poop out our bad DNA? Like, sounds like a stupid question, but...
DNA has a lot of bacteria in it, and because bacteria cells are small, they have a lot of DNA. So you do poop out a lot of DNA. and a lot of
That's a really cool fact. If nothing else I take away from today,
you also
that's what I'm
you
gonna
also
remember.
can't eat bacteria because there's so much DNA. It's too nitrogen rich, which is why bacteria is not a good source of food.
Which is unfortunate because it would be a great source of food if it could be.
Yeah, there's just, we can't handle all the nitrogen in it. There's just too much. So, because DNA is very nitrogen rich. That's, yeah. Yeah, where was I? So yeah, I was talking a little bit about CAH. The changing in, yeah, okay, I was talking about just like it can be like kind of annoying to manage because if you're like sick and throwing up, then you have to take more medication. So you have to like have a good understanding of the disease and how it works and like how your medications work. Because like if you're throwing up and you need cortisol to be in your body when you're fighting infection, like more cortisol, so you might have to like use injectables when you're sick. Like it's can be complicated.
Right, but this is only one possible
yeah, I'm just the point I want to make is that sometimes disorders of sex development aren't just disorders of sex development. There's also other parts to it. That's all I'm trying to say, really. And I'm just interested in this. That's the other reason I'm talking about it.
Okay. Where did you want to go next?
So we did touch on it earlier, but I just kind of wanted to go back to some of the talks about doing, because we were talking earlier about like in the 60s and earlier, we used to want to perform surgery on kids with like intersex or ambiguous genitalia. So there was like a little list in one of the resources I found of like doing it early or waiting. So and I will just like point out at the beginning that sometimes you have to do surgery because like they can't pee and like
right. So you
need to do that.
You mentioned intersex. What is this? Because I've heard of this a lot lately.
Yeah. So
like especially in the last 6 months in particular, I've been hearing intersex this and intersex that as if it's
it's like
this new
more
thing
of a
that
layman's term.
about.
It's more of a layman's term. It is still used, but like the medical term is the disorders of sex development, but like a lot of the advocacy organizations are calling themselves intersex because it's a little bit, again, we talked about like using the word disorder. So that's kind of one of the concerns from there.
So
but it basically intersex just means just something abnormal with the sex development.
Okay.
So it could even be like there's some like things like you can't make dihydrotestosterone, which is a more potent version of testosterone. And it like if you can make some but not a lot, you have like almost no symptoms and you might just be, oh, that's not the right one. But there are some diseases that qualify as intersex that basically just mean you're infertile and you have like no other symptoms.
Yeah, because seems here that the amount, like it says there's a lot of different types of intersex that are under the definition, and that changes, I guess, based on how you're approaching it or what you want to accomplish, because
it depends on what exactly your definition is.
The numbers seem to change between 0.018% or 1.7% of
yes, I found
population.
That statistic earlier and I didn't use it because I wasn't exactly sure. I figured it was one of those cases of different definitions. Like the very small number might be like just cases of like ambiguous genitalia. Like
those seem to be 0.02 to 0.05, but I feel like this is a distinction between the biological approach to the topic and a more cultural or political approach, which definitely seems to be changing how we're even approaching or talking about the thing that I guess sex difference in particular, because it is definitely has a complication. It's complicated and it tends to be a bit ambiguous, but at the same time, people seem to be able to redefine their terms in order to suit their needs, whatever those are.
there is definitely like some politics, but like the thing is, it's also like it's very hard to conduct research into like this area because it's all going to be observational, because obviously you can't do any like randomized control trials with this, because you can't be like, yeah, we're going to raise this group as men and this group as women. Like that's not something you can do. That's messed up.
Individuals do that with their children, which
yes, but now it's not a controlled circumstance, so
right.
And it's still unethical even though people do it.
Well, they claim it to be ethical because I guess if you follow something like Zimmerman, then you're just changing the gender and the sex doesn't matter, because look at that South African athlete. So it doesn't matter what we raise them to be. They can just, if it doesn't work, they can just change it later.
That was like an old argument, again, from when they were just changing genders, because they had this idea that like gender is 100% nurture. That was their idea. So what they were doing is so
that actually, if I could get into that particular, that comes from an old idea known as the Sapir-Whorf principle, where you have this idea that people using different languages see the world in different ways, because the language itself creates a different conception of reality. Therefore, if you use different words, you can change your conception of reality, which that was in, I think, the 30s or 40s. And this led into the Zimmerman's and Candace West, Don Zimmerman and Candace West, doing gender, where you have this cultural gender, which is linguistically created. And then, it's just, well, we're linguists, but like language is just semiotic, so it's symbolic. And so, something like a dress is, something that a girl does or says is a symbol of their thing. So they're performing this. Now that turns into, Judith Butler, who would come and say that, no, it doesn't matter. We can just, this is a fluid thing. They're separate, and then, it snowballs from there. So you have this idea that all you have to do is change your kids' conversation that they're having with the world, and then they can change their the reality of themselves.
Yeah, so, like that's kind of the like.
That's a simplification. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you though. They would say like, well, it doesn't really matter what they were born or what the thing is. It's just like they'd say like, this one, we've decided, the surgeon basically decided that they should be a male based on that they're XY and that their penis isn't too small. It's ridiculous. And so raise this one as a male, give them like, dinosaur toys, put them into sports, do all the traditional male stuff that they would have done in like the 60s and 70s, and they'll be fine. But the problem is that it's not just nurture. And we know this because like one of the most striking and obvious points is that 98, 99% of people are cisgendered. So like most...
But even can't there be a wait and see approach to this? So, you don't
that is the approach now, which is
so it's like give them trucks and dresses and see which one they like ignore.
Basically, well, actually the way that it works now is they first of all rule out any of the like more pressing concerns, like if they're having like the salt wasting or the cortisol deficiencies.
So things that will
it's always mortality. Medicine rule number 1 is rule out all the really bad stuff. So then figure out like what exactly is causing the problem. Then what you're going to do is you're going to do a pelvic ultrasound to look for which structures are present. You're also going to do a lot of genetic testing to see what exactly is going on, and then based on the evidence you're going to basically assign a gender is usually what happens. So they'll say like raise them as female, most of the genetic evidence and like their physical structures that are present lead them to be feminine. So probably raise them as female. And then usually the idea now is you could it's really like, again, the shared decision making thing where you discuss with the parents, but like the idea now is often to like hold off any like plastic surgery sort of type stuff that you would do to like make the genitalia look more like a normal man or woman until the child is like old enough to know. And sometimes this might involve like using puberty blockers.
Does it, you know anything about how much it manifests? Like if the kid goes outside and grabs a stick and starts hitting stuff, it's probably gonna lean towards
you know
being
what
male.
it's I grabbed sticks and hit stuff too, so it's
but like I mean like that's just a minor example.
You might,
of
you know what,
like,
honestly, I think it would depend on the kid. Like some kids are like pretty much like very much traditional masculine stuff. Some kids only want to play with dolls, but like you might know, but like ultimately the idea is that it should be up to the individual. So the idea is to not do surgeries that need to be done to like make them able to urinate, to like make it so that it's not going to like have any infection or issues or anything like that, correct any other issues, and then save the cosmetic stuff, and then save the cosmetic stuff for when they are old enough to decide for themselves.
Right. Would there also be complications with doing cosmetic
Yes.
stuff before the body is fully formed?
Well, surgery always has complications. No matter what surgery it is, there's always a complication. You're cutting your body open.
Because I can imagine going from this to full-size Jordan would change the stuff. Like my body is not just going to be like, okay, we're doing this now.
So it can affect, like this is just what I saw of like doing early surgery. You could get, they could like need later surgery in adolescence from like vaginal stenosis if you're like doing operations for some like making a vagina basically. It could have some scarring. It could affect their sexual function and ability, like their arousal ability. It could lead to like urinary issues, incontinence as well. So and some of the like more plastic surgery type, more cosmetic surgeries are like very hard, if not impossible, to reverse. So if you do a cosmetic surgery to like, well, I mean, if you did a cosmetic surgery to make it look like a female, right? You did the like inversion type surgery. There's a name for it that I can't remember right now, but that you can't really reverse that. So that's not something that you want to do when they're a baby. The other thing, though, I will say that's might be nice about doing it early is that now you don't have to get a major surgery on your genitalia when you're like 16 and going through puberty and in high school, because like that could be pretty traumatizing as well.
More than just a little, I think.
And like if you have like it might help the parents feel better if they're like not raising a kid that might have like all this stuff. The kid might like, and like kids are assholes. Like I'm not the first to say this, but kids are assholes, and if they like find out or like you do something weird, they're gonna bully you. So it might like help with that if you're just like raised as a traditional female and you're given the surgery already early. That might help with bullying. But again, this is why we have the idea of shared decision making. You sit down and you say like, what do you want to do? Let's talk about the options, talk about pros and cons. And like, again, I just like listed some random complications, but it would depend on the exact surgery, the exact structures that are present, like all like different factors that a surgeon would know and not me.
So it's complicated, you're saying?
Yes, that is what I'm saying. And like, the point was I just wanted to emphasize is that like, we're getting better.
Yeah. So
and I think there's something to be hopeful about here.
Well, they seem to be like people being able to make nuanced decisions, at least in our society. But we have now, why would but like you have that idea of like, you know, bullying, but then nobody should be able to be subject to bullying, so we need to make it so that everyone understands this. But that's almost a simplification of it. Well, I don't want my kid to be bullied, but I also want them to, you know, live the perfect life. We all want our children to live the best life they can, but that's straight up not going to happen for anybody. So you have to give your kid the best chance they can, and that takes a very long, drawn-out process of research and decision making on the part of the parents.
They're not expected to make the decision.
The parents and the doctors involved may also not be the best exemplars of virtue themselves. And so you naturally, I guess, get this persecution complex on that side. But I don't really know where I want to take this from here, but I've definitely seen a lot of, from, I guess, a lay perspective, we get an idea that, there's a lot of people seeing that the need to change from one thing to another. And almost like it seems like sometimes society is just being told that they all need to just switch sides.
I think the point that I've kind of been wanting to make throughout this is just that you should try to understand. And like the thing with this topic is that there is ambiguity, and there will continue to be ambiguity, because it's like, will we ever know exactly what's going on to every detail? And will we know like which socially is more likely to cause harm or cause benefit? We'll probably know more later, but for now we're working with what we got, and we're just trying to do the best that we can for the kids. Like, because at the end of the day, this is a person this baby is a person, and they're going to grow up to be a person, and we want them to be as successful as possible. We want them to be happy and contribute to society, and like not be so bogged down by this thing that they were just born with, because everyone's born with some crap, but we want them to try to be as happy and good as possible, right? That's kind of the idea.
There's two things I'd like to maybe pick your brain about then, just on your professional, quasi-professional experience so far. The first being I have this, I'm not sure if I'm like married to the idea, but I have this idea that youth is a good time. If you're ever going to be bullied, youth is probably the best time in your life to be bullied. And I would say that because everybody's coming from a common ground of ignorance, and everybody around you is kind of watching and learning how to socialize at the same time. So it's kind of a good place for gender talk and bullying. But on the same token, I don't want to assign this to our teachers.
So I have like a couple points to make based on that. So please. First, for like minor things, yes, for being pushed in the dirt every day and being called a piece of crap, like it's like when you are developing your coping mechanisms, like you're even younger than like youth. When you're developing your coping mechanisms when you're like very young and watching your parents, like you need to learn how to cope with emotion, because there's actually like a lot of really interesting research into what they call adverse childhood experiences and how those are related to like tons of different diseases, lots to do with inflammation, like substance use, like depression. Basically every psychiatric disorder can be related to having these experience. Yeah, like, and well, the really interesting thing is the link between depression and inflammation is like that. Like basically every inflammatory disease is comorbid with depression, which is really interesting.
And depression is very frequently comorbid with bowel dysfunction, which is really interesting to me.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I think even things like rheumatoid arthritis and like multiple sclerosis are like very, very highly correlated as well. It's like it's part of the, like, basically when a person comes with like new multiple sclerosis, you like basically do an assessment for depression along with the diagnosis. Like it's just part of the process now. So
I do want to clarify, I'm not talking about abuse. I'm talking just somebody being one-off comment, making a slight joke here and there. It is bullying, but I don't mean abuse, because nobody should endure abuse.
Yes, I wanted to clarify that too as well. But like the thing is that kids are so easy to teach. They want to learn. Their brain is like made to learn. Whereas when you're an adult, you kind of get stuck in your ways. You can still change, but it's harder, right? And
I hear that.
Like you have plastic, like your brains are plastic. They can change. They can do different things, but it's harder. It's just more difficult. Whereas a kid,
because I've already got a structure built
Yeah,
into my
they've
brain,
built
and
this-
I'm building
yeah.
onto that structure or within that structure.
yeah,
Like I've studied a lot of history and I've studied a lot of stuff, but if I want to go, every time I go and learn some coding, my brain's just like, why are you doing this to me? But I'm like, no, we need to learn this.
Yeah.
But I still generally will push myself, although that enthusiasm for the unknown, because there's more unknown when you're a kid, definitely helps.
Well, it's
although
not just because there's
I'm not
more.
a person that subscribes to, oh, I'm old, so I can't learn technology. And I'm just like, well, my dad learned how to use a computer before I did, so I don't know what your excuse is. But
Yeah, it's just, that's what I mean, is you can, like, it's like languages are a really good idea. Like, you can, if your kid has like a Spanish nanny, your kid can learn Spanish like very quickly and easily.
But the interesting thing
But
about
like, if I start living with a
languages,
Spanish person, I'm not going to pick up Spanish nearly as quickly.
But anybody who's a whatever they call that, linguist, polyglot, yeah, they can learn 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th languages more easily.
Yeah,
So
and they have less
not
chance of getting
necessarily
dementia.
The one exposure, it's just the fact that your brain is exposed to more sound, lets it be exposed to even more sound later on.
And like, so once you have
our culture of expertise is what's causing this age, we can't learn anything past a certain age idea.
Yeah,
I think that's more a product of specialization in an economy than anything else.
I don't want to learn anything new, rather than
we train our brains not to learn new things, to specialize, to only learn this one thing really well because it matters to us for so much of our lives, like during school, then testing, then our first job, then impressing the boss, then getting promoted. It's like our brains are wired to the function that provides us the most reward, right?
Well, if you hear something you don't like or agree with or understand, you feel bad. It's like, oh, I got to get back into what I know, that surety of the familiar.
Yeah, plus, I don't get that. It invigorates me. Every time I hear something I don't expect, I get excited as if I was 5 years old again. Like, I just want to learn everything.
Well, we've probably almost been conditioned by that because we've kind of been in that liminal space ourselves, where you know, kind of not quite an outcast of society, but not really on the A team, where we've known that, like, and almost trained ourselves to be like, I need to get better and better and better. But then it became habit, and then it became pleasure to just find new different things that we could use, because we didn't really ever fall into a stride of this is what works, this is what gets the bread at home, so this is all I'm going to do, this is all I need to know, well, that's all I need, that's all I know. And we never really fell into that because, well, we couldn't.
So that being said, Megan, what's your opinion on the youth's impressionability and how we should go about educating them on gender roles?
Jordan liked that. So I just, it's difficult and it's complicated because there are, like, I strongly believe that we shouldn't teach kids things that we don't, as fact, that we don't know are fact, and that if things are ambiguous, we should be teaching that it's ambiguous. So we shouldn't say things like, there's a, like, sex planet, I heard this, like, your sexuality is a universe and there's, like, planets, and it was just, like, completely overcomplicated and, like, felt like I was 14 and on Tumblr again. And, like, I don't think we should be teaching kids things that we don't know to be true. Like, we shouldn't say that sex and gender have no correlation, because that's not true. Most people that are born female with all the female structures are going to be happy being female. Most people. And so there's a correlation. It's not 100%. There is not an 100% correlation, but there is one, and we shouldn't deny that.
Well, probability is not certainty.
Yeah, and we also we also assume that there's a state in which now this is going to be dark, but we also assume that there's a state in which everyone can be happy, whereas some people may have the misfortune of having a string of certain disorders that might make it almost impossible to find an equilibrium with which they can become happy.
And like personality disorder.
Well, it's partially that
personality disorders, like they all come together.
Disorder I'm talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, there's like there are some like things that, and like again, this is often relates to those adverse childhood experiences that I was talking about earlier. That like some people, it's going to be very hard for them, but it's never impossible. So at least I continue that hope for myself. Like, and of course I'm in pharmacy school. I like drugs, so I'm gonna say that there are drugs to help with that. But I'm also going to recognize very deeply that drugs are just things and substances that change some receptors and do some things, and no drug comes without risks. No medical thing comes without risks, and like counseling is like probably more important than drugs for most things.
So diet and exercise are probably
diet and exercise is not some mystical thing that Western medicine doesn't know about. Everybody that studies medicine knows that diet and exercise are incredibly important. Pretty much any like pharmacist that you talk to, if you say, should everyone be taking vitamin D? They'll be like, yeah, probably, because like we just don't get enough sun here in Canada. That like probably everyone should take vitamin D, at least in the winter, because like you literally cannot make vitamin D. Even if I were to sunbathe naked at -30, which I would not recommend, you will not be able to make it just because there's too much atmosphere, basically, so the right wavelength doesn't get through that you need to catalyze that reaction. But like,
so why are we then, because we do teach our kids ambiguous things in science class, like how big is the universe? 13 billion light years, 16 billion light years?
I think it's like 98 actually, because it's been expanding for 13 billion years.
And then there's like a lot that we can't see because of the way light, but like at the same time, this is a very ambiguous thing, but we're like, has to have an age, and the kids aren't going to be able to abstract at this level, so that's a number.
Well, that's part of the problem, is that kids don't develop the ability for abstract thought until they're like a little bit older, and it kind of depends on the kid. Like some kids will get it when they're like 9, some kids it'll take till they're like 12. Like it's definitely like developing the ability to think in metaphors and abstractly is just not something that, and like some are just gonna like get a handle on it easier. So like trying to teach a small child about something like really ambiguous, like what we've been talking about, that's hard. But that doesn't mean we should just ignore it. Like we should start with like something like, it's complicated. Just because you were born with this doesn't mean that you're going to be a man. Just because you were born with vagina doesn't mean you're going to be a female. So you just keep it simple, and then as the kid gets older, you can make it more, add more of the ambiguity. That's generally what I think would probably be better.
Is that sort of the same approach they use to teach religion to kids, where they like simplify the Bible stories when they're young? They don't talk about all the blood and gore, and
even like science things. Like you start like learning about atoms, but you're learning like the like Rutherford Bohr model, and like which is like over 100 years old, and we know even the guys that came up with it like a year later were like, oh wait, this only works for hydrogen, lol. But we're still teaching it in schools because it's simple. And so it's kind of what you have to do.
That actually prevents people from learning it well later on. Like if you start getting into quantum physics and you're still thinking about physical matter as balls and not like wavelengths of energy.
Even like I had a really I took one like full year of physics at university, like just like the intro courses, and like man was it interesting, but I was not good at it. I just had such a hard time wrapping my head around some of this stuff. And like once we started getting into like wave equations and stuff, it was like, okay, that's cool, but what? Like it's
iterating
complicated.
Through matrices of other dimensions that store matrices.
And like it's also stupid because when I was in like school, I was like really wanted to get good marks, and I like studied too much. So I like learned things that were like not entirely correct, but so then my foundation is now like not quite right. So then when I go to university and I'm trying to learn physics, I have like classical Newtonian physics so like deeply embedded that when we start throwing in like quantum stuff, I'm like, what is happening? And like I just have a hard time wrapping my head around it. But
so to bring this around though, is that like you get this thing where they're teaching you these basics so you can like at least start. But then if you're teaching them too incorrect, then you're going to have these weird assumptions, and that you have to either dispel with, and the teacher knows that and a good teacher will know that, okay, here's the thing that we taught you, here's the thing that you were supposed to learn out of that, and here's the thing that we need to get rid of and replace. And a teacher that knows that will be able to do that. But right now we're teaching, like, you go look at stuff like the gender unicorn or something like that in elementary schools, and you're like, are you a masculine, feminine, or other? And now, what is other? Is there some third thing that we know, some other thing?
What's even the point of that?
They actually, no, I was actually like reading I was on the like one of the intersex advocacy websites, and they were saying that like raising them as a third gender is probably harmful because other people don't understand what that means, and it just makes it more complicated, and then makes you
frustrated.
Well, and it puts them in a special box of like, you are this, you're different and special from everyone else, which is like not always the most helpful way of thinking about yourself.
But then there's like physical attraction and emotional, which is apparently completely separate. And then you have identity and expression. So identify, but then you have all these complications, and you're trying to teach these to kids, which these are almost intentionally constructed to be, confusing.
Well, and the other issue with that is that they're not separate. Like, no. Again, there are differences in them, but they're not like for instance, I have a friend that's bisexual, and she is attracted to females, but she never wants to date a female. She doesn't want to live with one, but she's still attracted to them. That's the thing that can happen, right? But the what was my issue? Oh, I lost my point.
Well, it becomes like,
right. Okay, sorry, I remember my point.
Okay,
sorry. Is that it's not, there's differences, but they're not. It's like your mind and body, like back in the old mind and body days are being separate. They're not. Your thoughts influence your body. Like, it's a complicated relationship, and you can think of them as being separate for a metaphor for some states and some diseases and some like things that are going on. But at the end of the day, they're the same thing. And that's the thing with
still an open debate, though.
A lot of these is that but the thing is that when things are complicated, that's hard. And people like things to be like simple, one bit, like easy sentences to remember. Like, I want to watch a 20-second video that explains the difference between sex and gender. It's like, no, go away. You're not going to learn that. Like, that's not how this works. We can't just like, and there's so many things out there that are like that. And at least even if you don't understand them all, if you can at least recognize that there is a complex difference, even if you don't completely understand it, like, that's growth, and that's better.
So, and I think at some point that it comes down to, like, everyone's trying to fit themselves into a box, but the box is essentially, what is it to be you as that individual unit of humanity, not as, part of a whole, because you, like, which group do you belong to? Because, you get these, I'm looking at this particular one I'm looking at has 12 and 3 other different variables that when you put them together, you get like, after like 4 variables, you get into combinations in the millions, and eventually it just becomes you. So why are we not dealing with individuals when it comes to these issues, rather than why are we dealing with groups when we're dealing with individual developmental things?
I think one of the issues is that people are not recognizing that this is a tool to help you understand yourself. It's not a label and a box that you can put yourself in. It's just helping you think about what you think about yourself. Mm-hmm. That's what it's supposed to like run you through a thought process of like, okay, what am I attracted to? What sort of traits do I have? Like, do I like wearing dresses? Do I like hitting things with sticks? What does that mean? And it's just like some self-awareness. Mm-hmm. It's basically trying to teach you like some self-awareness, but in a very specific thing. And what you're supposed to, and I think the point that you want to get out of it isn't, I'm a like, and you just throw a bunch of words that are like half made up.
And you get a flag.
The point you want to get is that you understand how you work, and you don't need to put labels on yourself. That just, like, labels are nice because they're easy. Like, Jimmy's a trumpet player. Okay, now I remember who Jimmy is. And then as I get to know Jimmy more, then I don't have to just think of him as a trumpet player. I know him as more things. Like, they're not just labels anymore. And you shouldn't be thinking about yourself in labels. You should be thinking about yourself in a complex way, because you are yourself and you're complex.
And then the labels
you don't want to limit
you into
yourself.
other things that are associated. So trumpet player equals musician, musician equals artist, artist equals liberal voter. That's a bit of a jump, but we do make these irrational associations. And that
also, trumpet player means obnoxious. Deal with it, trumpet players.
yeah, going at her in the comments or something.
Yeah,
but
fight me.
But the I think the other thing is that we have these things that are also well defined now. Anybody can ask themselves, do I like men or women? And they can take a second and be like, women. And well, I remember doing this as a teenager and being like, what am I? Like, do I like men? And I came to these conclusions. And I think a lot of this also has to be honesty with yourself. Are you depressed because you aren't eating properly or not getting enough water? Or are you depressed because, you are single, and not because, you get these guys who are like, I can't get a girlfriend, therefore all women suck, and therefore and then you can come up with all kinds of crazy conclusions at that point.
We've been talking about depression a lot, like in the last semester that I did as well. And like sometimes people that are depressed just have like these really like odd thought patterns, and they get stuck in these like weird loops, and they try to talk you through the loops and you can't really follow them, and you're like, what are you talking about? What's your problem? And then you realize that it's almost a symptom and there's like something else going on. So
a big part of treating depression and stuff is recognizing those moments. Because once you're aware of them, you can sort of compartmentalize things and move off like the irrational ones from the rational ones. But
yeah, you can like just,
like you said, it's supposed to be like a tool to help you. It's not meant to incarcerate you into a way of being.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
That's where people take it too far. Because I mean, realistically speaking, how often is it actually relevant or useful to know someone's gender? Like meeting
unless
them
you're
at
like
a
trying to
table, you might want to say, oh, which person are you talking? It's the woman. There's 5 people there, one's female. That's helpful.
If I applied for a serving job at Earl's or something,
it's not meant to define the person.
No, I identify as a hot chick.
By them in a group.
Because like there's certain things, but if I'm like hiring a dishwasher, it's like, oh, you identify as I don't care. You've got hands and know how to work a lever. Like hired. And
I think the bigger problem is that we're over attributing gender to things, like saying there should be more women in CEO positions specifically. You're creating the problem by putting a requirement on there arbitrarily.
Well, so my like other job,
like this, talk them down, but
like I was talking about earlier with oil fields, like I have absolutely no desire to work in an oil field, and there's lots of women that also don't want to work in an oil field, and like forcing women to like do jobs that we don't want to do, that's not helping anyone. If we start doing this the other way around and say like we need more male nurses, like what if they don't want to do that? Like men and women have tendencies to move into certain jobs, and like even in like the most like equal countries, like you're looking at like the Nordic countries like Sweden and all those, they still have like big discrepancies in certain jobs. Like healthcare is like lots of women, and it used to be like nurses were women and more doctors were men, but even like, those like traditional surgeons still pretty masculine,
because
but like
there's so much competition for it, and all those men just be like, I gotta be a surgeon, and they'd like push that masculine ambition forward, and those kinds of things are so. But like at the same time, I'm a guy and I could work in an oil field. I don't want to.
Yeah, and
we're also partially biologically wired for prestige more than women, right?
Yeah.
So like there are reasons to our motivation that statistically should lend us towards more risky or more anxiety-ridden
and like
things that go,
maybe I'll get in trouble for saying some of this, but like we are still primates, and a lot of the more similar related primates have like complex social structures with like more male hierarchies and females choosing. I'm not saying that's what happens in humans. Humans, all of these sorts of instincts are like quite dulled because of this thing called giant frontal cortex, and being able to think for ourselves, but we still we still have some tendency towards like some hierarchy formation and like some tendency towards like female choice, but like again, it's a lot more subtle than in any of the other animal groups that exist.
So I was thinking then,
don't hurt me.
That might be a good spot to take a break, and I was maybe gonna ask you when we come back from the break to do a little bit of a recap just from start to finish, so we know like how atoms form molecules, form proteins, form.
Okay.
You're probably better at this than me, but you know, just the ground up, and then from there, I wanted to ask you just the only thing I've really read on this subject is a book called "Why Gender Matters" by Leonard Sachs, I think, and it talked about. Anyway, I'll get into that after. But did you have any final comments that you wanted to wrap up your opening spiel?
I think we kind of like covered. Like I rambled on about biology for a while. I talked really fast, so sorry.
Lectured.
I lectured. Yes. And we kind of were talking a little bit just about how how people are seeing sex and gender nowadays and how better to talk about it. But I think one of our main points was just that stuff is complicated, but that's not an excuse. You still need to learn about it.
Jordan, how about you?
Your mic's off.
I think it's good to reiterate that this was the purpose of all that was to emphasize the fact that these are connected. And what Megan was describing in her long lecture there, though it seemed complex, that is the basic structures that determine how we manifest after. And that's why these are important, because we are our biology. We're not separate from it. I keep thinking back to Harari, where he was saying that there is no mind, there is no soul, there is just us. And this is the basis for the creation of those structures that create these weird conscious creatures that are us, which are so complicated that it doesn't always quite work. And we're all of us, there's not like an ideal platonic human. We're all of us flawed in some way, but we work just well enough to get, the next generation going. And that's what biology wants us to do. But we are definitely creatures that exist beyond biology. And even though that is the basis, we can move beyond, just that. So it's not just, well, we're biologically determined. Well, yes, we are, obviously. But beyond biological determination, we can create other meaning for our lives. But again, that meaning itself is also rooted in that. So I guess accept that complexity and don't just, figure that you've got it. You're 15, you found this, Genderpedia, and now you've figured it out. All you have to do is check which flag means which, and you got it all figured out. Because if you, at any point in your life, if you feel like you've got it all figured out, that's usually in my life, especially, that's when you're about to fall off a cliff of ignorance and learn a whole bunch of new stuff, unless you stop yourself and continue to say, I've got it all figured out. So the connection, I think, is what is important here.
And the multiplicity of connections therein. Well said. So stay tuned. You've been listening to Frivolous Gravitas, and we will be coming at you at part 2 in a shake.